morning. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Jackie Kaplan-Perkins, and I am the Chicago and Midwest Director for Human Rights Watch. And we are thrilled to have you all here today for the launch of this report. I first want to start, I'm just going to take one quick minute and then introduce Kyle Knight, our researcher on this report. But I first want to take a minute and thank a few people, starting with, most importantly, I want to thank the Center on Halstead for hosting us today for this report. And thank all of you for being here. I want to say how excited we are in Chicago to be launching this report. This is a rare opportunity for us here, and really is one of the things I want to say about Human Rights Watch is that we are an organization, all of you here today know about us, that work in over 90 countries on a myriad of issues. Just 2 weeks ago, I was in Brazil for the launch of our Zika report, and I got to see firsthand the importance of what a difference our report can make for organizations working on the ground on key issues and with legislators on the issue of Zika, specifically in Brazil. And now we are thrilled to be able to launch here a completely different issue that covers our LGBT program, our women's rights, children's rights, health and human rights. And the report that you all have on your chair is called I Want to Be Like Nature Made Me. We're thrilled to have an incredible panel of experts, and Kyle will take a minute to introduce them and introduce how we got to working together on this report and some of our findings. And one of the things Human Rights Watch is really trying to do right now is really expand the way we talk about our reports, because this one is pretty thick. We've started to really use visuals. Today, if anybody wants to, is on Instagram, we're very excited to have activist Pigeon Pagonis, who is taking over our Instagram account with full consent of Human Rights Watch. So please follow us there. And in addition, we really spend a good deal of time doing videos. And so I want to show you a video right now that I think will introduce this issue better than I can. So here you go. Can people see?
The first kind of indication was we had an ultrasound, and they said, you're having a little girl. So we picked out girl names, and we kind of prepared for that. But one of the last ultrasounds that we had, the OBGYN said, well, you might actually be having a little boy. And he said, ultrasounds aren't that accurate, and so it's probably nothing, not to worry. But when she was born, right away the OB said, there's something that I don't know how to explain.
Intersex means that the internal genitalia, the external genitalia, the chromosomes, the hormones, and the person's physical appearance don't look or correspond to classically male or classically female. For many decades, the standard of care for intersex newborns included surgical procedures to make them look as typically female or typically male as possible.
Some doctors tell parents that these surgeries will make their child's body look like a typical boy or a typical girl. But these surgeries can have devastating consequences for the kids that can last a lifetime. We spoke to parents who told us they felt intense pressure from doctors to consent to surgeries even when those operations were medically unnecessary.
We wanted to make sure she got to see, the best specialists and the best providers who could, give us the answers. And it was disheartening.
We left feeling like we were on an island, with very little support. And while we were confident enough to not proceed with the surgery, I would be lying if I said we didn't have a lot of doubt about, oh my gosh, like they've told us all these awful things. Are we doing the wrong thing by our kid?
Parents talked about feeling bombarded with scary and confusing information. For instance, doctors told parents that if they chose not to have surgery on their kid would be bullied at school. However, a claim like that has never been substantiated in medical literature.
It's common that the discussion will be about how successful those surgeries can be, how safe those surgeries can be, and how well they can work in helping the child fit in. What they don't include still, for the most part, are discussions of the potential harms.
These surgeries carry the risk of scarring and nerve damage, infertility, incontinence, loss of sexual sensation and function, and the need to be on lifelong hormone replacement therapy.
I found out I was intersex. Freshman year, I retrieved my medical records and I learned not only was I intersex, but then I learned everything they did to me to try to take the intersex parts of me away. It was like getting the wind knocked out of me. When I was first born, doctors found undescended testes in my abdomen and removed them. When I was 4 years old, the surgeons decided to reduce the size of my clitoris. I had no knowledge of this. When I was 11, they said they were doing surgery on my bladder. And when I found out from my medical records, that was actually a non-consensual vaginoplasty.
When these irreversible surgeries are conducted on children, they can have a lifelong physical impact as well as psychological trauma. When intersex kids grow up, they may want some of these operations, but that should be their decision to make.
Physicians are very powerful in this equation. The medical saying, "do no harm," plays a prominent role in care for intersex individuals. We need to really think about the fact that there is a significant risk for harm.
There are two very rare instances when surgery is required on a newborn with a variance of sex development. One is when the internal organs are on the outside of the body, as if they were turned inside out. The other one would be to ensure that there's a place for urine to leave the body. Any other surgical procedure on the external genitalia of a newborn is cosmetic surgery and is not medically necessary.
Doctors across the US continue to conduct medically unnecessary, irreversible surgeries on intersex children when the kids are far too young to consent and when the operations could be safely deferred until the kids are old enough to decide for themselves. These surgeries need to stop.
I think our daughter is the best evidence for why surgery should be deferred, because she's awesome. Right after she was born, I got to spend a little time with her before she went to the incubator, and I remember I kept saying to her, like, I hope you're all right. I hope you're all right. And everybody was telling us all the things that were wrong with her. And that was so hard to hear as a parent. But I feel like these last 2.5 years, she's been doing nothing but proving to us that she's all right.
I wish my parents would have known that I would grow up and not want this to have happened to me. I wish they would have known that when the doctors came to them saying, your kid basically won't be lovable unless we change their vagina, change this, change that, take their clitoris out, etc., that they would have let that bounce off and no. Like, if my daughter's not sick, then you're not going to try to change her so that she could be loved. She should be loved for who she is.
All right, thank you, everyone. I think this is on. Is my mic? Move that one over, please. Thank you, everyone. My name is Kyle Knight. I'm the researcher at Human Rights Watch who wrote this report along with our partners at Interact. We are very excited to launch this document here today in Chicago. And I'm going to very quickly go through why it's important and this city is so pivotal for changing standards of care for medicine in the US, and then hand it off to our expert panel. Their bios are tucked inside the copies of the reports on your seats. And we have some really amazing experts and some legendary activists here today, and I want to give them as much time as possible to tell you their stories and the work that they're doing to change this. Medical standards in the States are often set by medical associations. As everyone knows, the American Medical Association is headquartered here in Chicago. This language up on the screen, which is also in the report itself, is a pending Board of Trustees resolution. And our job here is to encourage the AMA to push it through, to make it real, to make it the standard of care for all doctors across the country. We have also made recommendations to another Chicago-based medical organization, the American Academy of Pediatrics, to make their statement on intersex care consistent with their other statements on child health care. And we're encouraged that this morning they put out a statement in reaction to the report welcoming its release, and it shows that they're paying attention and they're willing to work with us to do exactly that. But I don't want to say that this is just going to focus on medical associations, because as you'll hear from our panel today, this is not the beginning of the movement when we launch a report like this. This is actually about 25 years into some really incredible, painstaking work. And it's going to take regulation. It's going to take the government stepping in to regulate the medical industry where it has failed to regulate itself for 25 years as these surgeries have grown increasingly controversial, even among doctors. So with that, I want to hand it over to our amazing panelists, starting with the Executive Director of our partner organization, Interact, Kimberly.
Thank you, Kyle. My name is Kimberly Zieselman, and I am Intersex. I am also, as Kyle said, the Executive Director of Interact. We are the nation's only organization that is exclusively dedicated to protecting the rights of children born with intersex traits. Interact was founded over 10 years ago after the medical community refused to engage with intersex activists for decades, despite an outcry from the community to put an end to non-consensual intersex surgeries on youth. Decades of outcry by many of the individuals here today in this room who have made incredible strides for our community. We realized correctly that we needed a dedicated organization tasked with holding the medical community accountable for their assault on our bodies. Our mission is to protect the rights of children born with intersex traits while also raising intersex visibility and empowering young intersex voices. We are so proud to have partnered with Human Rights Watch on this incredible, groundbreaking report. It will continue our work and bring the voices of intersex youth and their families to the physicians who are tasked with their care. We have been collaborating with medical associations for years. We have seen some progress, but not enough, and not nearly quickly enough. Every major human rights organization that has considered this issue has condemned the practice and demanded that healthy intersex people not be subjected to these medically unnecessary invasive surgeries. It's time for these surgeries to stop. Enough is enough. As the home of the nation's only intersex youth advocacy organization, I can tell you that these kids are doing fine just as they are. We are seeing more and more young intersex people who are standing up to tell the world that their bodies aren't shameful. They aren't problems that need to be fixed. And I know firsthand how devastating the impact these surgeries can have, not just on our bodies, but also on our souls. These surgeries tell us that we must be erased before we can even tell our doctors who we are, before we even know who we are. We're tired at this point of just raising awareness about the existence of intersex. It's time to get outraged. We know that most physicians want to do the right thing for their patients, and the right thing, unequivocally, is to wait until an intersex person can participate in these life-altering decisions. The small community of doctors who refuse to bring their practice in line with human rights standards tell us that we're just angry activists, and that there's actually a silent majority of happy patients out there, although they've failed to ever produce them for us. We can't find them, and we may be angry, but we have a right to be. It's been over 20 years of our strong voices calling for change, yet these harmful surgeries continue to happen every day across this country, including right here in Chicago. The UN isn't just a bunch of angry activists. The World Health Organization isn't just a bunch of angry activists. The US State Department isn't just a bunch of angry activists. The leadership of every major LGBTQ organization in the US isn't just a bunch of angry activists. Every intersex organization in the world can't be just a bunch of angry activists. And now Human Rights Watch joins the chorus, and they too cannot be deemed just a bunch of angry activists. All of us here are standing together on the right side of history today, and we're not going to wait any longer to protect our kids. Please join us.
Hello, thanks for inviting me. My name is Eric Loman. I'm going to move this up a bit so I don't have to hunch. Okay. So as you can see in my bio, I'm on the board of directors for Interact, and I joined the organization willingly and proudly because my partner gave birth to a daughter with CAH, and so I was very quickly thrust into a situation I felt very unprepared for, although considerably more prepared, I would say, than lots of parents are, because I was doing graduate work and my partner was a nurse. We had access to medical research and journals and things like that. So what my advocacy, what I like to do is basically tell you the quick story about how my daughter Rosie's birth went and the pressure that we face from the medical community. And Rosie is about to turn 5 in just a couple of weeks, so this is quite recent. This is not me raising a 20-year-old or something like that. This is quite recent medical history. And then I'd like to tell you a bit about what her life is like now and essentially how uneventful her life continues to be, and it's sort of a way to encourage anybody who is willing to listen that there is no rush to consent to these surgeries. So the way that it happened with us is very similar to what you saw in the video with Travis Shaw, that we had been in a situation in which our daughter was delivered and we were suddenly facing a adrenal crisis because she has CAH. And so we were brought into a big meeting at a very large table full of endocrinologists and pediatric psychologists and gynecologists and urologists, and a very intimidating table. And everybody went around and they sort of told us what Rosie's care was going to be like. And then we got to a situation where we got to the pediatric urologist who said that he had 2 recommendations for us, or we had 2 options, rather. The first one was a clitoral reduction surgery and a vaginoplasty, and that should be done at 6 months. And the other surgery was a vaginoplasty. And by this point, we had already decided that we were going to do no surgery. And so I got very hostile very quickly and asked why we weren't being presented with the option that we already knew was possible. There had been tests run that showed that there was no urinary reflux, so theoretically and functionally, there was no reason to consent to surgery. There was no need for surgery. And he pushed back, immediately started to push back. He did not like being challenged, did not like being questioned. He started to provide some arguments for why we should consent to surgery, none of which have ever been substantiated in the medical literature, which I was happy to say I had already read by that point. And so with the hostility in the room, he opted to condescend and clear the room and say, well, I can tell you're upset. Let's revisit this in a couple of days, which we were upset. Of course, Rosie was very sick. So a few days later, and as Kyle mentioned, a lot of the arguments that medical community, the surgeons will provide is that there's this sort of question that parents are concerned about proficiency of the surgeon rather than any of these other host of issues. So what this doctor did then was, at the second meeting, was come back fully armed to try to convince us that we were making a big mistake. One of the ways that he attempted to do this was showing us images on a computer of a surgery that he had conducted within the last couple of weeks in order to show us that he was capable of producing, surgically constructing a vagina on an infant, that was what was holding us back, that we weren't convinced that he could do it. We showed that we were not being listened to, that our concerns were not being taken seriously, that he was not interested in hearing any of the opinions of all of these activists who have had these surgeries and grown into adults who have had a myriad of problems. There was no discussion of side effects. There was no discussion of whether or not it was safe to anesthetize a 6-month-old child, which we know now is very dangerous. So this is how that second meeting went, and it continued to grow hostile. We accused him of not listening, taking our concerns seriously, or being anywhere aware of any of the opinions that were contrary to his own. And that meeting also he abruptly ended. So now we were still required to see him, and in the last meeting we had, it was essentially the same in the clinic where I brought Rosie in, and we were essentially dismissed. He basically wondered why we hadn't consented to surgery, questioned our parenting style, and then had told us that if we ever need anything to, give him a call or whatever, which I didn't do. So we kept Rosie, we brought her back to the States, and we have since continued to allow her to grow. And we've continued to allow her to be who she wants to be. And we don't have any problems with her body. She doesn't seem to have any problems with her body. And we've taken a number of steps to try to make her visible as somebody who can put the brakes on a parent who may be in a situation that we found ourselves in, where there's a lot of pressure from the medical community to consent to a surgery quickly. And there's a lot of information flying around that is unsubstantiated or incorrect or is lacking in alternative positions. We want Rosie to be the one that you can see, who says, like, if you just love your child, if you just talk to them, if you just let them be, they'll be fine. There's no rush. And one of the things I like to say about our position, or my position especially, and I think I would probably get support from the assembled group, is that I'm not anti-surgery, and I don't think any of us are anti-surgery. Instead, we're pro-consent. I just want Rosie to be able to be part of this decision. It's not about whether or not she should have a surgery or can, or if surgery is right or wrong. Those are not important questions. The important question is whether or not she gets to be part of that decision, and whether or not she has a role in it, whether or not she gets to put her position, make it known. And that's what's important. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Linnell Stephanie Long, and I am Intersex. I am also the Vice President of Interact. I'm on the Board of Directors of the AIS-DSD support group. And I am also one of those activists that's been called angry, disgruntled, and ungrateful. I've been an intersex activist since 1999. I stood on the front lines with ISNA, Intersex Society of North America. We've tried to get doctors to understand our point of view from an emotional perspective, not from an angry perspective, because doctors don't listen to you when you're angry. So what we did was we went out there and we told our stories. We told our stories to medical professionals, to students, to anyone that would listen. Currently, I am I'm Vice President of Interact on the Board of Directors of AIS-DSD support group. AIS-DSD support group is, we have an annual conference, and we just had our annual conference last week, and a bunch of us were there. It's a great conference. We all come together. It's full of intersex people, DSD, whichever you prefer, and we come there, we support each other through workshops and talking with medical professionals, and just supporting each other the best way we can. Next year, the conference is coming to Chicago, the weekend of July the 19th. This is an important event because the last time the conference was in Chicago was actually my first conference, which was, I think, 10 years ago. This is great. This is great for me because it's nice to have the conference come back to my hometown, Chicago. I've been in Chicago all my life, and I'm proud to be a Chicagoan. I'm also proud to be intersex. Feel free, I'm reading my notes, sorry. I'm really honored to be here among the people here because I feel like I earned my place here. I've done tremendous work for the intersex community, and my passion and my drive have always been for the improvement of the intersex community. I cheer up whenever I talk about it because I see little kids at our conference that have to undergo unnecessary surgery. And we have to explain to them why. And they have so many questions when they come to us. And we're grateful for the physicians that are available there to answer their questions. I'm not angry, I'm not disgruntled, and nor am I, what's the last one? Nor am I ungrateful. I was a patient at the University in Chicago, here in Chicago, and I spent many years as a career as a patient. Now I can say I'm no longer a victim, I'm more of a survivor. And I tell my story whenever I can for people to know that this is important work that we're doing. This is necessary work that we're doing. We're not doing this. I'm not doing this because it's easy work. It's, no way is this easy. It's not easy to stand in front of a bunch of medical professionals to tell my story, but it's necessary. And it's necessary because we have to save the kids that are still undergoing these cosmetic surgeries. So I'm glad to be here. I will keep my introduction short, and thank you.
Thank you so much to Kyle and the rest of HRW for inviting me to speak today. It's really humbling to share the stage with activists who really started it all. And their stories are and really should be the focus of this presentation. I'm here merely to prescribe a physician's, specifically a urologist's perspective of the things that need to still change to protect future intersex children from unnecessary medical intervention. So I treated my first intersex patient just about 10 years ago now during residency, and she has haunted me ever since. And as one of the first cases in which I really failed to hold my oath to do no harm. She was a 17-year-old girl who with complete androgen sensitivity syndrome, who had been booked for surgery by one of my senior attending physicians. And I'm ashamed that in my ignorance, I participated in a surgery to remove her gonads with hardly any reservations at all. I mean, after all, it's a very common medical school boards question. You know, what happens if a girl comes in with bilateral hernias? They have CIS and their gonads can be cancerous. And what I didn't learn in medical school, though, was that the rate of these cancers was only 1%. So there's a 99% likelihood that I render this girl menopausal, dependent on hormones for the rest of her life, unnecessarily. After this case, the more I sort of delved into intersex history and to the extreme harm that has been perpetuated on these people, was that I really became convinced that the care of intersex patients is one of the most profound failures of modern medicine. It's a failure of paternalism, it's a failure of informed consent, and it's a failure of the medical community to do the necessary study to identify the ways in which they can cause severe damage. And the key thing I realized is that it's really not just the failure of specific physicians who recommend wrong treatment, it's an institutional problem. It's a failure of medical education, and the fact that very little, I would say maybe half an hour of most medical school curriculums are taught on this subject, which could encompass years of research and of education. It's a failure of the notion that there is a standard of care that can be enforced. Okay, so earlier this year, medical opposition to a bill limiting intersex surgery claimed that when early elective surgery is considered, and I'm going to quote from the statement released by a coalition of medical professionals, quote, "Many voices are heard. DSD is a complicated collection of medical problems that requires a multidisciplinary team evaluation," unquote. So 10 years after the American Academy of Pediatrics issued a consensus statement recommending these sophisticated teams, they still remain the exception rather than the rule. Indeed, several of the top children's hospitals in the country still do not have dedicated DSD clinics. Many, if not the majority of intersex children are identified outside of the 30 or so metropolitan areas that offer a multidisciplinary team, and this lack of standardization, this scattershot approach to intersex care leads to a wide variation in care that can lead to fear, confusion, and a lot of medically unnecessary intervention. It's also a failure of the medical profession to police itself. Intersex care is obviously complex, and it's inarguable that individualized care is the gold standard. And to some, the recommendations of this report may seem draconian. You know, I can name off the top of my head people that I've known, that I met, that I know who are going to react very viscerally to this report. Still, medical leaders are starting to speak up. Just last month, the Palm Center in San Diego issued a powerful statement by 3 former surgeons general, one of which is a pediatric endocrinologist who determined that, quote, "Research does not support the practice of cosmetic infant genitalplasty," unquote, and asks that, quote, "Professionals and parents who face this difficult decision will heed the growing consensus that the practice should stop." I mean, our medical community needs to follow these recommendations. I know that there are physicians of conscience out there. In fact, I believe that they are the silent majority. Just 2 weeks ago, I was at the AAS DSD support group and participated in a so-called group share where a group of patients, parents, doctors sat together to talk about their stories. And this literally brought 5 members of the medical community to tears because they understood the power of the anecdote. However, until there's a mandate that can't be denied, individual physicians will continue to do harm based on their individual biases, their assumptions of what it means for a child to be normal. The question is, of course, the question that everybody on this table has is, what does it take to change medical practice? In the 20 years since Bo and her colleagues, since Linnell first blew the whistle on the harm done to intersex people, doctors have continued to downplay the power of the anecdote, the power of story, saying that they need more data to justify withholding treatment. The American Academy of Pediatrics statement that they just issued yesterday called for the urgent need for more studies. And I would argue two things. And so what they argue is that they need more data to justify withholding treatment. And I would argue that they don't have the data to be able to wholeheartedly defend treatment. I also think that it's time for the medical community to face the fact that they will never have the volume of data that are required to, for instance, change prostate cancer treatment recommendations. As a urologist, I'm very acutely aware of the way that there's been a field shift in the way that prostate cancer is treated. And that took literally thousands of databases, tens of thousands of people, because prostate cancer is the most common cancer in men. They could get that data. They can get the information. That is not the truth in intersex care. It's been 20 years, and they haven't been able to generate even a fraction of the studies that they require. What they do have, however, are hundreds, perhaps thousands of stories of people who feel betrayed by the very doctors that hoped to help them. In this case, I feel that the burden of proof should be laid on physicians to prove that their interventions will cause more good than harm, rather than on patients who have to live with the many instances where their treatment caused more harm than good. In the past few years alone, I've seen how practice patterns have changed, not only in urology, but also in, for example, OBGYN, based on the advocacy and truth-telling of a small amount of brave individuals. Any of you who's a medical writer here knows about the case of mutilation in uterine specimens in OBGYN. And in the case of mutilation of these specimens, which can seed cancers, of course, patients had the benefit of a governmental agency, of the FDA, who set down a ruling. But there's no such governmental oversight in surgeons, and thus far medical societies have stopped short of regulating themselves. And I understand why. I understand that it's difficult to put restrictions on the livelihood of your colleagues. And this is where everyone in this room comes in, every one of you. If doctors do not have the will to police themselves, then what we can do as friends and family of future intersex people is to educate ourselves and others, whether it be through the media or through books or discussions in health and biology classrooms and middle schools and high school. We must all arm each other with intersex awareness so that future patients will be less likely to ask for surgery and less likely to be pressed into surgery based on fear of the unknown.
My name is Bo Laurent. When I was born in 1956, they couldn't tell what sex I was. And the medical professionals who were present were probably just sort of had an emotional meltdown about that. And they kept my mother sedated for 3 days, and then they dismissed her, telling her that I was a boy, but with screwed up genitals, and maybe they'd do surgery sometime several years down the road. My parents, of course, didn't return to those doctors. But they did a few years later find some doctors in New York who were had some specialty in intersex, and that was a completely new thing then. Those are some of the very first doctors who thought of themselves as knowing something about intersex. And those doctors took me in for sex determination. And I don't think that's what my parents understood, but I had a boy's name, and they took me in and they decided that because I had an ovaries and a uterus and a very large clitoris, that the clitoris was the problem. So they just removed the clitoris, told my parents I was really a girl and that they should change my clothing, my name. They should remove every bit of evidence that the boy had ever existed from their homes, get rid of photographs and birthday cards, move to another town and not tell anybody where they went, and never tell me what happened. And come for annual follow-ups. They didn't go for annual follow-ups, and they never told me what happened. But I wondered why I have no clitoris and why I can't learn to masturbate. I knew I'd been hospitalized as an infant, and when I tried to find out what had happened to me, every medical professional I approached for help actually lied to me and told me that in some cases they actually said, we'll get your medical records, and then I have documentation they received the records, and then they told me that they somehow couldn't get them. I did eventually get hold of my medical records, and I discovered this history of sex change. And when I discovered that, I realized everyone in my family, my aunts, uncles, grandparents, everyone knows this but me, right? So not only had they left me sexually dysfunctional, but they'd also created a situation in which whatever shame they thought I might have felt about being different was amplified 1,000,000 times. How can this be something so shameful that your doctors won't tell you and everyone can know about it but you? In 1993, I was feeling so depressed and lonely and suicidal. I was on the verge of taking some action, and I realized I don't want to take my life without letting the doctors who did this to me know how bad it was. And I decided that I'm going to figure out how to get better and how to take my life back. And I also realized that much worse than the clitorectomy was the shame that they had created for me, and that somehow I was going to get over that. I knew that the gay and lesbian movement had made progress when it said gay is not shameful. So I decided I was going to figure out how to not be ashamed. And I started to talk about myself. And I had been left with the impression from reading medical literature that what happened to me was extraordinarily rare. But when I started to talk about it, I quickly met other people who said, oh, that happened to my cousin, that happened to my coworker's child, and I realized it's not rare, it's actually relatively common. And so pretty soon I visited some of the practitioners who had done this to me, and I discovered they'd never followed anybody into adulthood, they don't know anything about human sexuality, they have no idea how female orgasm works, they don't know a psychologist to recommend to me, they're like utterly helpless, and they thought what had been done to me was great. They said, oh, you've received really excellent care. So in 1993, I founded the Intersex Society of North America, and a large part of what we did was to bring people together who had so many similar stories and to make those stories visible. Lots of people in those days were too ashamed to be public, but we could publish things with pseudonyms or you know, whatnot. And pretty soon, actually, people also were willing to be public. We appeared in the New York Times. We appeared on NBC Dateline. We appeared in Newsweek and Time Magazine. And I was pretty sure that when doctors heard how harmful these things had been to us, they would change, because I knew doctors don't go into medicine to hurt people. If you'd told me in 1993 or 1995 or 1997 that in 25 years later we'd still be trying to change this, I would have been dumbfounded. I just would never have believed it could take this long. It's actually 25 years. 1993 is when we started. This is 24 years later. Several generations have passed, and still practice hasn't changed. Doctors continually ask the wrong question. Not only do they not have any data, and they insist they can't change practice without data, but when they consider getting data, they ask all the wrong questions, not how happy are you, or are you grateful for these interventions, but if we made you a girl, did you stay a girl? And by that standard, I'm a success. I think that's about it. This report, I'm tremendously grateful for this report. These are stories we have been telling and telling and telling. Doctors who do these things, they know this. They already know this. This report, the significance is not that we're going to inform doctors that what they do is harmful. It's that it's time to bring some sort of bigger leverage to bear. There have to be consequences. There has to be some more force to be able to change this practice. And I'm really grateful for this, and I'm looking forward to that work beginning now.
All right, thank you, everyone. We're happy to take questions, or at least, I can speak for everyone here. Everyone's
I'm happy to take any question, personal or otherwise.
From the audience. We can't, the online broadcast can't hear you, so if you ask a question, we're just going to repeat it back to you as well. So if you could speak up
we'll be able to hear you from up here. We're happy to answer questions for anyone on the panel here. Not all at once. All right, yeah.
Jill Daly, Chicago Tribune. What's next? What's the next step?
Go ahead.
There's still a lot of work to do. I think the next step is to continue towards these recommendations that are made in this report, of which there are many and they're varied. As we've been doing for several years now, we are trying to get at this problem from a variety of different angles. Whether it's a legislative ban or policy change at the medical association level, or both, that's what we're doing next. And we need your help.
I have a question from Instagram from a physician.
Yes?
She went through medical school believing that this is exactly what you should do, the things that we're talking about not doing, and she said this panel really changed her mind, especially when she learned that the percentage for cancer in gonads is so low. Her question is, these intersex people on the panel are so brave for sharing their story. I want to help. And then she asked Human Rights Watch, how can we help? How can I help? And I would love to know what I can tell them. It's kind of an extension of this.
Yeah, I think one of the things we're looking for from, repeat the question. We have a doctor who wrote in on our Instagram feed saying that a lot of what she's heard in terms of these standards of care are what she was taught in medical school and how she believed this until today, until this presentation from these incredibly courageous intersex people up here. She believed this was the right standard of care. She now understands it's not, and she wants to know how she can help. I think we want to see this report, this document, to be a tool for anyone who wants to help. It exists for exactly that reason. It's on our website for free for exactly that reason. So if you're in the medical community, write to the AMA, write to the AAP, put it on your social media account, teach your colleagues, bring this up. What we heard over and over again as we traveled the country from doctors is that there's a lot of doctors out there who, even if they understand this is the standard of care, they are increasingly uncomfortable recommending these medically unnecessary surgeries, but they just haven't found their voice yet. Like Dr. Wong said, this is the silent majority out there, are the doctors who are increasingly uncomfortable with the status quo. They want things to change and they're just not quite sure how to get their footing to say that. Use this report as a tool to do exactly that.
I want to add, all over North America, there are hospitals in urban areas that take care of babies with intersex. Babies who are born and identified as intersex, they get sent to one of these hospitals. So if you're in the medical profession, find out where the children in your area who are intersex get sent and go over there and find out what's happening and make sure not only that the practitioners know about this document, but that the hospital administration knows about this document and that people who oversee risk for the hospital know about this document.
If I could also add, one thing that I think is incredibly important, I spoke to a nurse once who was in labor and delivery and in her entire career had delivered or been present for the delivery of one intersex baby, one intersex child. And the parents were completely dumbfounded and blindsided by the recommendations. And this nurse basically didn't know what she could do. She didn't think it was right, the recommendation for surgery, but she didn't know what her power could be in that situation. And I can speak from experience that I would have wanted more than anything a nurse or a doctor or somebody to pull us aside and say, you don't have to listen to them. Like, you don't have to do this. If you know better, then you can say something, right? Like, you can make that parent feel at ease and say, don't rush into anything, do your research, get this document into their hands, tell them that the research exists and that these claims are not necessarily true. Like, I would have done anything for a medical professional to advocate for me or with me at the time when we were under the most amount of pressure. It would have made a world of difference for somebody to say, this isn't true, this isn't right, you can take your time and make a decision that you're comfortable with, and these surgeries are not supported by the medical research. Take your time and do research. So a doctor in that position has an incredible amount of power to put the brakes on this and say, the surgeon is wrong, do the research, it's available.
Yeah, it depends on what kind of doctor they are. If they're in the community, they need to go to their own pediatrician. They need to go to the pediatricians. They need to go to the OBGYNs. Give them a copy of this report, because those are the people at the front lines who are going to see the vast majority of kids for the very first time. If they're in an academic setting, they need to talk to the dean of the medical school to make sure that intersex care is something that is covered in the curriculum. They need to bring people in and show how you can be intersex and grow up to be an amazing, beautiful, accomplished adult, as these people are. One of the most horrifying things that I heard, that I've experienced in the few years that I've been an activist, is an online doctors group that asked for advice on to give to a parent who had an amniocentesis saying that their child was going to be an XY, when it would be a boy. But on the ultrasound following them, they couldn't determine the genitalia. And these parents were thinking about aborting that child. And you can imagine that now we know this, any one of these people could have been that child. And the fact that parents are so afraid of ambiguous, quote, ambiguous genitalia, or difference in sexual differentiation, that they can make that choice shows that every one of us has the opportunity to increase the awareness so that that parent won't be afraid the next time.
I'm one of the earliest people to have been subjected to this model of care. When doctors say we need more data to change the practice, there was no data used to introduce these practices. And before the 1960s, all intersex people grew up without any of these interventions. And we actually do know something about them. There's been histories published of intersex people before.
The one in the back?
Last night at the reception, we talked about Illinois 10, 15 years ago was one of the first states that passed outlawing genital mutilation. And some attorneys last night believe that law could apply to this. So, I'm happy to follow up on that. And with the people last night this evening, and it sounds like it's a legal argument that can be made that can be used to launch such laws in other states. And so I'm just willing to work on that. I know several people about the organization know where to find me.
Thank you. The question was, the comment was, there are laws in many states, including the state of Illinois, and as well as at the federal level, that outlaw female genital mutilation. And that we know that those laws would apply to intersex children just as well. There's no reason why they wouldn't. So there is a growing interest amongst attorneys and people in the community, as well as our own advocacy groups, to start enforcing those laws. And we appreciate that support. Go ahead. Last fall, the question was whether or not our federal government has done anything to help. A couple of things I can mention. Last year, we were successful in getting intersex included in basically the definition of sex discrimination under the Health and Human Services regulations for the under the Healthcare Act. And that is significant, as I believe it's the first time that intersex discrimination on the basis of sex characteristics, that would include intersex people, has ever been included in regulation. Then we had an election. And as far as I know, we still have that law on the books, but that's, we'll see. The clock is ticking, perhaps. But that was a real interest of the Department of Health and Human Services at the time in the Office of Civil Rights just a few months ago. That was really promising. Beyond that, there are certainly lawmakers who are interested in this issue, and there's an increasing amount of interest at the federal level as well as at the state level. Last year also, just before the election, the State Department issued a statement basically saying that these surgeries shouldn't be happening. And it was in recognition of Intersex Awareness Day, which is a day that's recognized globally on October 26th. So the US government has publicly made a statement against these surgeries and urging reform. But we are now dealing with a different administration. And so, the thing I want to also point out, though, about that is this is truly an intersectional issue. This is not an issue about, the left or the right or being a Republican or a Democrat. It affects everybody. It's an issue that intersects, and at its core is really a children's rights issue, obviously a human rights issue, an issue of reproductive justice, as well as an issue of for LGBTQ rights. It's a very intersectional issue, and I think it is hands down one that everyone should be concerned about, including this administration.
Clearly this report is focusing on the situation in the US for good reason. Could you give a sense of what some of the international trends, better practice and developments internationally that are significant in terms of the rights of intersex?
Sure. Yeah, we chose to design, the report, sorry. The question was about, could we put this in the international context? This report focuses very specifically on the United States, but could we give a sense of what's happening elsewhere in the world in terms of advocacy and maybe even progress? We chose to work on this project with Interact as an international human rights organization because this paradigm of care began here in the US and has been effectively exported to every corner of the world as the medical standard of care. And it's something that activists all over the world are fighting against in very different ways and in very successful and admirable ways. As you can see in the timeline that we have in the report, and there's an interactive version online for those watching at home, there have been, in recent years, this groundswell of organizing, and I know that Kimberly has represented Interact as well in the US movement at some amazing international meetings to discuss strategies. At the moment, there is only one country in the world that has issued a comprehensive ban on these surgeries, and that's Malta. But there have been glints of progress elsewhere, and there's really extraordinary groups working on it on the ground in basically every corner of the world. I don't know if you have stuff to add for that.
No, I just, I'll echo what Kyle said and just mention that recently there was the 4th International Intersex Forum held in Amsterdam just a couple months ago, and these forums have been held since I think about 2012. And every year they get bigger. And this year was really significant in that there was representation, intersex people wanting to advocate, already some of them actively advocating quite a bit, all together in one room, representing every single region of the globe. So it was a very diverse group, and to see that just in 5 years, the change and the growth of the global intersex activist community that is becoming more and more cohesive and more impactful. So this is truly a global movement, and we appreciate the hard work of our peers outside of the US.
Someone said if you can shout out some of the groups across the globe doing this work, they would like to add a name.
There are many, and so there are many. Oh, Linnell, you can answer this.
Sure.
This is great.
There are many, but there is one that's doing amazing work in Australia, which is the organization Intersect International Australia, OII. They also have groups throughout the world. There's OII America, North America, and Canada, and other areas of the world. If you go to their website, oii.org.au, you can get links to different organizations throughout the world. They're doing tremendous work, and they've started doing tremendous work way before America, way before we started. I just want to congratulate OII Australia for the work that they're doing and mention them.
There are many groups. I think I run the risk of leaving somebody out, though, if I make a long list, and I don't want to do that. There's a number of groups that are pretty easy to Google online that are doing tremendous work. OII is a big network of different groups in many different countries. But there are also individual activists. There are groups that are just one or two people in countries where there's very little advocacy, where there is a real fear about difference and speaking up. And they're doing groundbreaking and actually really dangerous in some cases work to raise awareness about intersex visibility and intersex human rights. So we have huge respect for our peers doing this hard work around the globe.
All right, we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Georgianne Davis, and I just want to personally thank all of my fellow intersex activists on that panel for all of the work you've done to pave the way for future generations of intersex people and activists to fight. And hopefully we won't need future generations from this. But I would like wondering if the panel can maybe comment on why it is that trans folks seem to not be able to get procedures or any sort of medical interventions they do want, while intersex folks are subjected to interventions they don't want. Maybe as a panel you can reflect on that.
Good question, Jordan.
I think I can speak to that.
Can you repeat the question first?
Can you repeat the question, please?
The Georgianne's final question was, why is it that there's so much resistance in the medical profession to offer procedures to transsexuals? And they're very similar procedures to what's done to intersex. Transsexuals want these procedures and doctors resist. Intersex people don't want these procedures and doctors insist. And I think the reason why is doctors who perform these things are really afraid of sexual difference. And so they're insisting on inflicting these practices on infants to try to make them normal. And when they're confronted with a transsexual person, they think the transsexual person would be less normal with these interventions, and so they resist.
And I think that another way of looking at that, it ties into another key recommendation we've made. There are great standards of care out there for transgender youth. And they focus in particular on reversible interventions, hormone blockers, hormone supplements, psychological care, counseling, peer support, really helping a kid understand their gender identity, affirming it, and moving in later when the kid can consent to the irreversible surgical procedures, when the kid can make that choice for themselves. That's essentially all we're asking for intersex kids. We just want the same standards of care to be applied, and we just want the medical community to refocus its effort. Stop putting so much attention and resources into these early surgeries where the kid can't consent, and refocus on adolescents and adults who want some interventions, who want some care, and who want this expertise that the medical community has built up over the years.
I want to thank everybody again for coming. I want to thank the Center on Halsted again for hosting us. I want to thank the Chicago committee, who's been very supportive, and we have members of Human Rights Watch Global Donors Network who support our LGBT work, as well as many other supporters and activists in the room. And I mostly want to thank our panel, who I think we should all give another round of applause. And our partners with Interact, please, everybody in the room, take time to use social media. Follow Pigeon on Instagram, retweet, share anything that you're seeing on Facebook around the report. Make sure to review the recommendations, and our panelists will be around to answer questions for a little bit, as well as Graham Reed, who's the director of Human Rights Watch LGBT program. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.